Hi, my name is John. For 12 years, I believed I had built something solid with Emily: marriage, companionship, a rhythm of life that was stable if not spectacular. We had our routines: work, home, the occasional vacation, a circle of friends, small disagreements, and reconciliations that felt like proof of love rather than cracks in its foundation. To the outside world, and to myself for the longest time, we were steady. Ordinary maybe, but strong in a way that seemed unshakable. That illusion started to fracture one Thursday evening. Emily emerged from the bedroom transformed. She wore the kind of black dress reserved for significant occasions, paired with heels that made her taller, sharper, more deliberate in her steps. Her hair fell in practiced waves, and her makeup carried the kind of precision she never bothered with for the casual dinners we shared together. I remember sitting on the couch, watching her glide past me, the faint trace of perfume lingering in the air after she closed the front door. I remember the twisting in my gut, a slow, creeping unease that gnawed at the edges of my certainty. In a marriage, you learn the subtle shifts, the unspoken signals. A sigh that lasts too long, an averted glance, the careless choice of words. For years I had ignored those whispers, chalking them up to stress, to moods, to the ebb and flow of long-term partnership. But that night, something felt different. It wasn't just a mood. It was a wall. She came home late. Too late. Her hair was no longer perfectly set, her lipstick faintly smeared. She moved around the house as though nothing were unusual. I tried to steady myself, to remind myself of the trust one had given her for over a decade, but trust built on blindness begins to buckle under the weight of doubt. In the days that followed, the unease grew close. Emily disappeared into vague outings, her explanations curt and shallow, her eyes darting away when I asked too much. I felt myself shrinking, pacing the house like a ghost haunting his own life, rehearsing scenarios I didn't want to believe. A man can feel the temperature shift in his own home. What had once been warm was now chilled with distance, like sleeping next to a stranger who carried 1,000 secrets behind her skin. I began to notice everything. The lingering silences when she scrolled through her phone. The way she dressed with renewed attention to detail on nights she claimed to be meeting coworkers. The faint smell of cologne not my own on her clothes. With every piece, a mosaic of betrayal began to assemble itself, though I resisted the image it formed. To admit it outright would mean acknowledging that the foundation of my life was cracking beneath my feet. It was only a matter of time before suspicion hardened into certainty. One evening, driven by a combination of dread and the need to know, I followed her. The decision was not made lightly, it was born of sleepless nights and a hollow ache in my chest that refused to quiet. I sat in my car, a few houses down, and watched as Emily left, confident and radiant, striding into the night like she was stepping into a different life. I trailed behind her, my heart hammering with each turn of the wheel. The destination was not a restaurant, not the bustling chatter of coworkers at a familiar bar. It was a dimly lit place tucked into the corner of the city, the kind of bar that thrived in secrecy. I parked across the street, sweat prickling at the back of my neck, and waited. She disappeared inside, and minutes later, another car pulled up. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, the type who seemed to belong to another world than mine. He carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed he deserved attention. Emily greeted him with a smile I hadn't seen in years. A smile that had once been mine. They embraced, not with the casual affection of friends but with the lingering intimacy of two people who had crossed lines they should never have touched. It was then, in the glow of neon lights spilling across the sidewalk, that my world cracked open. I stayed there for hours, immobilized by shock, watching them share drinks, laughter, and touches that had once been the language of our marriage. I snapped a photo or two, not for evidence at first, but as a way of convincing myself that what I was witnessing was real. Each click of the shutter was a nail in the coffin of the life I thought I knew. When they finally disappeared into the back of the bar where private rooms were rented, my chest hollowed out. I stumbled back to my car, my hands trembling so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. I sat in the silence of the night, my breath shallow, my thoughts scattered. The truth was undeniable now, and denial had been my last refuge. This moment of following Emily and witnessing her infidelity marks a pivotal shift from suspicion to concrete evidence, shattering John's denial and forcing him to confront the reality of betrayal. The emotional toll is evident in his physical reactions, highlighting how betrayal can manifest as profound shock and immobilization. Ultimately, this event catalyzes John's journey from passive observer to active seeker of truth. By the time I drove home, it was past midnight. She returned hours later, moving around the house with casual indifference, humming softly as though the night had been unremarkable. I stared at her, my throat dry, my chest heavy with 1,000 unasked questions. Her presence felt foreign, like sharing space with a stranger who had borrowed the face of the woman I loved. That night, lying awake in bed, the truth sank its claws into me fully. Emily was not the woman I thought she was. The marriage I had built my identity around was not what I believed it to be. The quiet routines, the shared memories, the promises we had spoken, they had all been eroded by lies whispered in shadows. I stared at the ceiling, my heart hammering against my ribs, the word pathetic echoing in my head. She had used it once, dismissively, cutting deeper than any other insult could have. And yet, in that moment, I realized what was pathetic wasn't me. It was the illusion I had clung to, the denial I had wrapped around myself like a blanket. That night marked the beginning of my unraveling. It was the first time I admitted to myself that Emily was gone long before I ever followed her. The woman who shared my home was already living a double life, and the man who once believed in her was now faced with a choice: collapse beneath the weight of betrayal or confront the storm head-on. The cracks had begun, and there was no turning back. The morning after that night at the bar, I moved through the house like a ghost. Emily brewed her coffee, scrolled through her phone, and hummed as if her late-night adventure had been nothing more than a social call. Her indifference was almost more damaging than the betrayal itself. It was as if my presence no longer mattered, as if I were an accessory in the background of her new life. I studied her with new eyes. Every gesture, every casual movement carried layers of meaning now. When she lingered too long over her phone, I imagined his name flashing across her screen. When she slipped on a dress that clung to her body, I imagined his hands on it. When she left the house in a rush of perfume and confidence, I imagined his car waiting somewhere nearby. My imagination became my tormentor, but it was also the only map I had to navigate this new reality. The question that consumed me was not whether she was unfaithful, that was clear. It was why. Why had 12 years of loyalty and effort not been enough? Why had she chosen secrecy over honesty, lies over the truth? I cycled through every memory of our marriage, replaying arguments, missed opportunities, times when routine dulled our spark. I interrogated myself relentlessly, searching for cracks I might have caused, for failures I might have overlooked. Betrayal has a way of turning its blade inward. But there were moments when the self-blame gave way to clarity. I had not forced her to lie. I had not asked her to betray. She had made her choices freely, and those choices spoke volumes about her values, not mine. Even in those moments of clarity, though, I struggled with the hollowness inside me. The person I trusted most had become the person I trusted least, and the ground beneath my feet was no longer solid. Driven by the need for certainty, I did what I had once considered unthinkable. While Emily showered, I took her phone and installed tracking software I had researched obsessively during sleepless nights. It was not something I was proud of, but pride had no place left in this marriage. I needed truth, even if it destroyed me. The first notifications arrived while I sat at my desk at work. They were messages from a number unsaved in her contacts, but the content left no doubt. He told her he couldn't stop thinking about her. She told him how much she had needed their night together. She joked about my supposed cluelessness, about how easily she could get away with anything because I lacked the courage to confront her. Reading those words was like swallowing glass. I stared at my phone until the letters blurred, my hands trembling so violently that I had to set it down. Betrayal written in pixels carries the same weight as betrayal spoken aloud. Maybe more, because it lingers, unerasable, repeating its cruelty each time you look. Installing the tracking software and discovering the incriminating messages represents John's desperate quest for undeniable proof, transforming his emotional pain into actionable intelligence. This act, though invasive, empowers him by shifting the power dynamic, allowing him to move from victimhood to strategic planning. It underscores the psychological impact of betrayal, where self-doubt gives way to a hardened resolve for self-preservation. I forced myself to stay calm. Rage would only give her more power. If I confronted her then, she would deny, manipulate, twist the narrative until I was left questioning my own sanity. I had seen flashes of that manipulation already in her dismissive words, in the way she turned suspicion back on me. No, I decided, I would not confront her yet. I would gather. I would prepare. For days, I played the role she expected of me. I smiled at the right moments, nodded through her explanations, kissed her cheek when she offered mechanical affection. Beneath the surface, I was building a case, not just against her, but for myself. A case that would allow me to reclaim my dignity. The tracking app became a window into her second life. I watched her move across the city in real time, meeting him in hotel rooms, his apartment, and the bar that had already seared itself into my memory. Each pin on the map was another scar carved into my chest. Yet with every scar came resolve. I began documenting, screenshotting, printing. I built a folder thick with evidence, texts, photos, receipts, location histories. Proof that could not be denied, not even by her. I started to prepare quietly for what came next. I opened a separate bank account. I met with a divorce lawyer under the pretense of a work lunch. I began shifting small amounts of money, just enough to go unnoticed. Each step was a rehearsal for freedom, though at the time it felt like survival. Emily continued as though nothing was wrong. She dressed up, slipped out, came home late. Her arrogance grew with each successful lie. Each night I pretended not to notice. It was as if she believed herself invincible, untouchable, beyond consequence. In her eyes, I was weak. I was background noise. I was the safe harbor she could return to after setting fire to everything we had built. One Saturday evening became the breaking point. She claimed she was meeting girlfriends for drinks. I tracked her to a hotel, watched her arrive in her usual flourish of perfume and heels, watched him stride into the lobby minutes later. They met openly, almost brazenly, hand in hand, laughter echoing through the hotel foyer. I recorded the scene on my phone, capturing in seconds what 12 years of trust had disintegrated into. That night, as she returned home glowing with satisfaction, I looked at her and realized something had shifted in me. I was no longer pleading silently for her honesty. I was no longer hoping for an explanation that might stitch the wound shut. I was past the point of salvage. What I felt now was not sorrow, but determination. The storm had gathered its full strength, and I was no longer standing exposed in its path. I was learning to anchor myself, to plant my feet firmly in the truth, even if that truth tore apart the life I thought I knew. In the silence of my mind, I began to hear a different voice, quieter but steadier. It told me that betrayal was not the end of me. It told me that pain, though sharp, could also be clarifying. It told me that what Emily had taken from me was not my worth, but only her own integrity. I began to understand that survival was not enough. I needed something more. I needed liberation. The days that followed were an exercise in control. I lived two lives, one visible, where I smiled politely, nodded through conversations, and carried myself as though nothing had changed, and one hidden, where I catalogued every betrayal, every lie, every moment of Emily's double life. To her, I remained the steady, predictable husband. In reality, I was no longer her partner, I was her witness. The folder of evidence grew thicker with each passing day. Printouts of texts in which she confessed her longing for Ryan, maps dotted with her movements, still images of them walking hand in hand into hotels. Each piece was a fragment of the puzzle, and together they painted the portrait of a marriage that no longer existed. Collecting it all was painful, but strangely empowering. For the first time in weeks, I felt in control. I realized quickly that exposure was not something to be rushed. Confrontation without preparation would leave me vulnerable, an easy target for her deflections and manipulations. She had already proven she was willing to twist the narrative, to make me feel like the untrustworthy one. I needed undeniable proof, and I needed an audience that could not be swayed by her words. That is when I decided to involve her parents. They had always been kind to me, welcoming me into their family without hesitation. I felt they deserved to know the truth, but more importantly, I needed them to bear witness. Emily thrived in shadows, I wanted to drag everything into the light. I invited them to our home one evening under the pretense of an important conversation. I sat them down in the living room, the folder heavy in my lap, my pulse steady in a way it hadn't been for weeks. When Emily arrived home and saw them there, confusion flashed across her face, quickly replaced by unease. It was the first crack in her armor I had seen. I laid the folder on the table and let the truth spill out. Not in words spoken directly to her, but in the cold clarity of printed messages, timestamps, receipts, and photographs. I watched her parents' faces shift from confusion to horror, then to disappointment so heavy it seemed to press down on the room itself. For once, Emily's usual air of superiority faltered. The confrontation was not an explosion. It was something colder, sharper. It was the presentation of truth without room for denial. For years, she had counted on her ability to manipulate, to evade, to charm her way out of uncomfortable situations. But this was different. The evidence stripped her bare. Her parents' presence stripped defenses further. She tried to posture, to shift blame, but the words rang hollow in the silence that followed. Her father's disappointment weighed on her more than my accusations ever could. Her mother's tears cut deeper than any argument. For the first time, Emily was forced to sit in the wreckage of her own choices. The confrontation with Emily in front of her parents serves as a strategic exposure that neutralizes her manipulative tendencies, turning personal betrayal into a public reckoning. By involving witnesses, John ensures the truth cannot be dismissed or twisted, marking a turning point where he regains narrative control. This event illustrates the power of evidence and support systems in overcoming emotional manipulation within relationships. When she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, I felt a strange calm. Not relief, not yet, but clarity. I had taken the truth out of my head, where it tormented me, and placed it into the open, where it could no longer be denied. The betrayal was no longer just my burden to carry. That night, she returned with anger in her eyes, spitting accusations about humiliation and betrayal, not hers, but mine, for daring to reveal her secret. In her mind, the true crime was not her infidelity but my refusal to play along with the illusion. For a moment, I almost pitied her. She was trapped in a web of her own making, and the walls she had built to protect herself were crumbling. Yet her fury no longer pierced me. I saw it for what it was, the thrashing of someone losing control. And with that realization came something I had not felt in weeks, strength. The following morning, I informed her of my decision. I told her I had consulted a lawyer, that the process of separation had already begun. For a brief moment, I saw a panic flicker across her face before it hardened into disdain. She mocked me, belittled me, tried to convince me that 12 years should not be discarded so easily. But the irony was clear, she had discarded them long before I did. I walked away from the conversation with a clarity that surprised me. It was not the end of something sacred, because the sacred bond had already been broken by her. What ended was my participation in the lie. In the weeks that followed, the practical work of separation consumed me. Paperwork, legal meetings, and financial reorganizing became my new routine. It was exhausting, but every document signed was another step out of the cage I hadn't realized I was living in. Emily fought back in petty ways. She demanded more than was fair, threatened to drag out the process, tried to portray herself as the victim. But the folder I had built spoke louder than either of us. Her resistance crumbled under the weight of her own actions. By the time the divorce was finalized, she looked diminished. The man she had sacrificed our marriage for was no longer at her side. The glow of arrogance she had worn so proudly was gone, replaced by a weariness that spoke of consequences she had not anticipated. Finalizing the divorce signifies the legal and emotional closure of a toxic chapter, allowing John to reclaim his autonomy after years of deception. Emily's diminished state reflects the natural consequences of her actions, emphasizing themes of accountability and the fleeting nature of illicit pursuits. This event reinforces John's growth, transforming his pain into a foundation for independence. I left her the house, the furniture, even the car. Possessions no longer mattered to me. What mattered was my freedom, my dignity, and the knowledge that I had survived the storm without breaking. For 12 years, I had believed my life was tied to hers. But betrayal, as devastating as it is, has a way of reminding us that we are whole on our own. The reckoning had come and gone, and I was still standing. Stronger, in fact, than I had been in years. After the divorce papers were signed, silence filled the spaces that Emily once occupied. The house that had felt suffocating during those final months suddenly became a cavern of stillness. I had left most of it behind, walls, furniture, memories, all hers now. What remained for me was a modest apartment, sparsely decorated, but untouched by deceit. The emptiness was liberating. The first days in my new place felt strange. The quiet was both unsettling and soothing. For years, I had lived with the constant hum of tension, the late-night absences, the unanswered questions, the gnawing suspicion that eroded trust. Now, in the silence, there were no lies to decode, no subtle insults to endure. Only my own breathing, my own thoughts. At first, they were heavy. But with time, they began to feel lighter. The hardest part was confronting the questions I had avoided for so long. How had I missed the signs? Why had I clung to a version of Emily that no longer existed? In the beginning, these questions tormented me. I replayed every moment, every look, every word, wondering when exactly the love we once shared had turned into contempt. But eventually, I realized the futility of searching for a single moment of betrayal. It wasn't one night at a bar, one message, or one lie, it was a gradual erosion, a choice repeated until it became a pattern. Understanding that gave me peace. Her betrayal was not a reflection of my worth but of her own choices, her own emptiness. I had been loyal, steady, perhaps even predictable, but predictability is not a flaw when it is rooted in commitment. Stability is a gift, not a weakness. She had sought chaos and called it passion. I had offered trust and she had called it boring. The labels no longer mattered. What mattered was that I could finally see the truth without the fog of denial. Slowly, I began reclaiming pieces of myself that had been lost. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, people Emily had dismissed as unimportant. They welcomed me back without judgment, and their presence reminded me that I was not as alone as I had once believed. I picked up hobbies that had gathered dust, books I wanted to read, hikes I had put off, projects I had always meant to start but never had the time or energy for. The silence in my apartment became a canvas, not a prison. Each day was an opportunity to paint something new, however small. Some mornings it was simply making coffee in peace, savoring the taste without glancing at the clock to see when Emily might storm in with demands. Some evenings it was sitting on the balcony, watching the sunset, and realizing I no longer had to brace myself for disappointment. There were difficult moments, of course. Nights when the weight of 12 years pressed down on me, when the bed felt too large, when memories crept in uninvited. I allowed myself to feel them but refused to let them anchor me. Grief, I realized, was not a sign of weakness but of release. Each tear, each pang of loneliness, was part of the process of healing. Meanwhile, word reached me through mutual acquaintances about Emily's life after me. Ryan, the man she had risked everything for, had already drifted away. He was not the anchor she had hoped for but another fleeting storm. The excitement she had traded stability for quickly turned into instability of its own. She struggled, but I no longer felt the need to carry her burdens. The consequences of her choices were hers alone to bear. This knowledge did not bring me joy or satisfaction. Instead, it brought perspective. For so long, I had been consumed by questions of fairness, of justice, of whether she would ever face the cost of what she had done. Seeing her unravel made me realize I didn't need vengeance. I only needed freedom. Her downfall was not my healing. My healing came from walking away and refusing to look back. As weeks turned into months, I noticed changes in myself. My shoulders no longer carried the weight of suspicion. My thoughts no longer revolved around her whereabouts or her lies. The word pathetic, once a dagger in my chest, lost its sting. I had survived the worst she could throw at me, and I was still here. Stronger, sharper, more aware of my worth than I had ever been while bound to her. The silence had become my ally. It was in that quiet that I rebuilt my foundation, brick by brick, choice by choice. I was not just surviving, I was beginning to thrive. And in that thriving, I found something Emily never could: peace. Life after betrayal is not just about walking away, it is about learning how to stand tall again. Once the initial storm had passed and silence became familiar, I began to recognize the deeper work ahead. The divorce was not the end of my journey, it was the beginning of rebuilding myself from the ground up. I started with small routines. Simple acts like making my bed each morning, cooking meals for myself, or keeping my new apartment in order gave me a sense of structure. These routines were not just chores, they were reminders that I was capable of creating stability on my own. For years, I had tied my sense of purpose to a marriage that no longer existed. Now, I was learning that purpose could come from within. I threw myself into work, not as an escape, but as a way to prove to myself that I was still capable of focus and growth. Projects that had once felt overwhelming suddenly became manageable. My productivity soared, not because I was trying to bury the pain, but because the fog of constant suspicion had lifted. When trust is broken, every thought is clouded by doubt. Once I let go, my mind became clear again. In the evenings, I turned to activities that reminded me of who I was before Emily's shadow grew over everything. I rediscovered old passions: sketching, reading, long walks under the open sky. I explored new ones too, signing up for classes I'd always been curious about. Each new interest was like a brick in the foundation of the man I was becoming, a man separate from the role of husband, separate from betrayal. Physically, I challenged myself as well. Exercise became more than a habit, it became therapy. With every mile I ran, every weight I lifted, I shed the heaviness of those years. My body grew stronger, and with it, so did my mind. The mirror no longer reflected the weary, suspicious man who had once sat in a car watching his wife embrace another man. It reflected someone resilient, someone in control. The most important rebuilding, however, was internal. I began to confront the wounds Emily's betrayal had left behind. For a long time, I believed her words, that I was boring, predictable, not enough. But those were projections of her own dissatisfaction, not truths about me. Through reflection and self-awareness, I untangled her lies from my identity. I learned to appreciate the qualities she had mocked. Predictability is not weakness, it is reliability. Stability is not dullness, it is strength. Kindness, loyalty, and commitment are not flaws to be ridiculed, they are the cornerstones of a meaningful life. What she dismissed, others would value. Most importantly, I learned to value those qualities in myself. Friends who had quietly faded during my marriage returned to my life. They reminded me of the person I had been before betrayal, and they celebrated the man I was becoming. I no longer felt ashamed of what had happened, instead, I saw it as a turning point that revealed truths I had once ignored. Occasionally, whispers of Emily's life reached me. Struggles with money, arguments with Ryan, who eventually left, and attempts to piece together a narrative where she remained the victim. None of it moved me anymore. Her downfall was not my victory, just as her betrayal had not been my destruction. We were simply on different paths now, hers marred by consequences, mine illuminated by clarity. The weight of resentment gradually lifted. Forgiveness was not for her, it was for me. I forgave myself for staying too long, for ignoring the warning signs, for sacrificing my own peace in the name of loyalty. I forgave her not because she deserved it, but because I refused to let bitterness poison my new beginning. Rebuilding myself was not about erasing the past. It was about integrating it, understanding it, and using it as fuel to grow. Pain became my teacher, and resilience became my reward. John's rebuilding process post-divorce highlights the transformative power of self-reflection and routine in healing from trauma, turning solitude into a space for personal growth. By reclaiming hobbies and relationships, he reconstructs his identity independent of the marriage, demonstrating resilience as an active choice. This phase emphasizes that recovery involves not just external changes but internal forgiveness and self-validation. I no longer defined myself as the man whose wife had betrayed him. I defined myself as the man who had survived betrayal, rebuilt his life, and discovered strength he never knew he had. And with every passing day, the cracks left behind were no longer scars of weakness. They were proof of survival, reminders that I had endured the storm and come out stronger. This is not the end of my life, not the end of my future, but the end of a chapter that once defined me. When the papers were signed and the dust settled, I expected to feel broken, hollow, stripped of purpose. Instead, I felt something else, relief. A weight I had carried for years was gone, and in its place grew something I had almost forgotten, peace. For so long, I had lived in suspicion, second-guessing every word, every action, every late night. That constant tension had eaten away at me, turning love into fear and trust into doubt. Now, the silence of my apartment was not loneliness, it was freedom. The absence of lies was a gift I didn't realize I needed. I walked through life with a lighter step. Decisions were my own again. My time, my energy, my future, all reclaimed. The betrayal that once felt like the end of the world became the very thing that set me free from a prison I didn't even know I was living in. I looked back at Emily not with bitterness, but with clarity. She had made her choices, and those choices carried consequences. The excitement she chased slipped through her fingers, leaving her with the emptiness she had tried to escape. I no longer pitied her, nor did I crave her remorse. Her journey was hers alone, and mine had diverged from it the moment I chose myself over her betrayal. Healing did not come overnight. There were moments when memories threatened to drag me back, moments when anger clawed at me. But with each passing day, the grip of the past loosened. What once cut deep now felt distant, like echoes fading into silence. Resilience became my anchor. I had survived not only her betrayal but also the unraveling of the life I thought I knew. I had faced the truth, endured the pain, and come out whole. Stronger, wiser, unbroken. The man I was becoming no longer lived in the shadow of someone else's choices. Freedom revealed itself in unexpected ways. In mornings when I woke with calm instead of anxiety. In friendships that deepened without the barrier of secrecy and shame. In new experiences that reminded me of the vastness of life outside a broken marriage. I realized that I was not defined by what Emily had done, nor by the years we shared. I was defined by what I chose to do after. And I chose strength. I chose clarity. I chose freedom. So, I leave this story behind not as a victim, but as a man who found liberation in loss. Emily faces the wreckage of her own making, while I walk forward untethered, unharmed, and confident. This is not the end. This is the beginning.